Hello, and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality, to you by Traces.Dreams. I'm your host, Paul Mason, and I'm very fortunate today to be joined by Nicholas Hope. Nicholas, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
What perspectives and experiences do you bring to this discussion?
I've worked as an actor for the past around about 30, 35 years, I suppose. And I think that, partially speaking, a lot of what you're looking for as an actor when you do a role is what makes that character stand outside of what people consider as normal. What makes them stand out? And at the same time, that character also has to be someone that an audience can empathize with, they can understand. So that, I suppose, is what I bring to this discussion.
So a sense of the believable, but also something that's a bit of an outlier as well at the same time.
Yes, effectively, how do you make the apparent abnormal suddenly come across to an audience as potentially normal?
I love that. So let me ask you, what is normal?
Well, when you asked me, to be part of this interview, I thought a bit about that. And I thought, well, for one thing, as soon as you ask me that, I start thinking about humans and what is normal in humans. It struck me as interesting that I didn't think, well, living on the planet is what we think of as normal. And yet, in a universal sense, that's pretty abnormal, so far as we can work out. We haven't found any other life forms anywhere else. So we're fairly abnormal to begin with. I have another anecdote that comes from it. I lived in Norway for a while, and I'll give this anecdote because it kind of defines the difference. I was visiting a friend, and we were sat with a group of people in her flat, and a late arrival came, and that late arrival was furious. And she said, "You wouldn't believe what happened to me when I was walking through the park. I was walking through this park, and this effing American said hello to me. And I could tell from the look on his face that he wanted me to say hello back." And everybody in that room nodded as if this was normal, which to me it wasn't. And I asked what the problem was, and she said, "Well, what do you think I was walking through a park for? I wanted my own time. I didn't want interrupted in my private time by some stranger who wanted me to affirm his presence." Now, that's there. They all saw that as very normal. And it replicated something I had noticed in Norway, that you, generally speaking, did not nod to people on the street or pass a smile, which I thought of as abnormal. But when I brought it up with Norwegians, they saw my process as abnormal. So what is normal? I think what is normal for most people is what is considered as normal within the small parameters that they live in. And anything outside of that becomes abnormal. So normality is, in a way, what is recognized by your tribe. And it becomes difficult now because we see our tribe, in a way, as very extensive. We see it as a nation, for one thing. And we see it worldwide because of the advanced communications we are able to have. And so a lot of people appear pretty abnormal to a lot of other people.
The way in which you've decentered our sense of our definition of normality from the beginning there is so interesting. Taking that completely universalistic perspective, and when I say universalistic, from the perspective of the universe,
Yeah.
human life and all life on this planet is rather abnormal from the universe's perspective. And then to bring us back down to that example in a park in Norway, where what was normal for the American was not normal for the Norwegian, completely captured for me how normality is about defining the parameters of our our tribe's behaviors and the behaviors that exist outside our tribe. And in a global world, how difficult it is to have that sense of normality constantly challenged by an increasingly permeable definition of tribe.
As I said at the beginning, I work in acting, and a lot of the work has been in film and TV. And it is, of course, of note that even when I think of that, my ambitions were to be in something that's massive and goes worldwide. And yet, when I think of that, and this is a horrible thing to say, I am thinking my tribes. So I'm thinking Europe and America and Canada. I don't actually consider, say, South America, China,
Mm.
the billions of people in China. How famous, how rich would I be to reach all those? I don't even necessarily consider Japan. And a lot of the time, when I watch films from those areas, I find them fascinating, but I find them fascinating because a lot of the cultural antecedents that come with them are so alien to me.
Mm.
I am watching an, for me, abnormal reality or story. Yet at the same time, I can start to begin to know what emotions are carrying on. So there's a commonality, I think, to emotion. And I'm talking about emotions, really. But the environment that brings them on can be radically different.
I love what you're bringing to the discussion here, because the discussion here is when we think about normality and when we think about the world and when we think about the globe, the way in which we think about it is completely centered in our own experience. And even what we define as our world is sometimes very limited to the first things that come to mind. And for me, this comes to mind when we talk about world music, for example. When we ask people, what do you think of as world music? It's everything other than their own music. Like,
Yes.
classical music isn't world music, hip hop isn't necessarily world music, rock and roll isn't world music. It's the, the Caribbean music, it's the Senegalese music, it's the Siberian music,
Uh-huh.
Tuvan throat singing. It's the other that gets encapsulated in a very ethnocentric definition of world music. And one thing for me is that we're not just bringing egocentric, ethnocentric ideas to the table when we talk about these concepts. We're also talking about our perceptual sensibilities, because the way
Yes.
in which we interpret, in your case, interpret movies from other societies around the world, we are sensing them through our body in a completely different way to the way in which they were intended to be perceived by local audiences.
Yes. Yes, you're right.
So when you think about the localization of the role that you're playing, I guess implicit in the process of creating that character and bringing that character to stage or to screen, you're not just thinking about the character, you're thinking about all these parameters. Is that correct?
You try to, yes. That's the general, Stanislavskian idea. But you have to put yourself in it. So if I were in this situation, now to be able to answer, if I were in this situation, what would I do? How would I react? But to answer that, you have to know what that situation is. And that situation will be economic and cultural and environmental and placed in a time. So then you need to learn about all those things and try to consider how would they affect me.
I'm really enamored by this concept, but I want to go back on something. Stanislavskian. What are we talking about when we're saying
Oh, I apologize.
Stanislavski? No, don't apologize. It's an
Um,
opportunity to learn.
Stanislavski was one of the first people to codify a method of acting that defined how you can relate to a character and how you can find the emotional realities, and who wrote it down. He was a Russian actor and apparently codified it because he needed to, as an actor, stop his terror of going on stage. And he became so Stanislavski is a standard text, and when you look at all the acting texts, you can almost always, when you look at the steps that they take, there's various people. There's Meisner and a whole load of others. But when you look at the steps they take, they tend to go back to their beginning point is Stanislavski.
I'm really interested in here because I think the concept of what can go global is interesting, because when you're talking about codes and standards, Stanislavski is writing from his own culture-bound experiences, I assume. And as with any author or philosopher or thinker, they're going to be guided and biased by their own cultural experiences. But what's interesting is some codes and standards go global, and other codes and standards remain very context bound, very field dependent, very localized, and incapable of going global. In the
Mm.
acting world, are there examples of practices that have gone global very easily, and other practices? And I'm thinking West Sumatran Rundai theatre. It's very local to West Sumatra, hasn't even traveled much out of West Sumatra throughout the Indonesian archipelago, and it's not a theatre style which has globalized. But Hollywood, on the other hand, with all its economical, fiscal power and political power, and also technology at its disposal, has very readily gone global. Just as Bollywood, for example, has been hugely popular outside of India and in some ways stimulated the Nigerian film industry. What what standards and codes remain very localized, and what standards and codes in acting and film and theatre can go global?
I think that's a difficult question for me to ask because I don't know the answer and I wouldn't be able to define it. But in thinking of it, if we think of Indigenous Australians and that form of storytelling, the dancing and their form of singing and telling stories hasn't really globalized at all. And I think most Indigenous cultures who had very specific formats didn't globalize that much. What made it happen for that kind of Hollywood or classic theatrical presentation that we are familiar with in the West, I'm not sure.
You're prompting me to think, when giving examples of Australian Indigenous art and expression in terms of musical expression and artistic expression, what seems to have globalized is reductive elements of it.
Yes.
The didgeridoo has gone global, and suddenly everyone, again, that's a very uh,
Yes.
ethnocentric definition of everyone right there. But outside of Australia, people think, oh, all Australian Aboriginals play the didgeridoo, which is a misperception, but it's a very reductive element of Australian Indigenous culture, which has gone global. Same with,
Yes.
same,
Dot painting.
yeah, not all groups use that style of painting.
Mm.
And there's a lot of Australian Aboriginal contemporary artists who are not doing dot
Mm.
painting as well. And yet, what goes global takes on its own life. I don't think it's no longer culture bound, that's for sure. It's the elements of culture that can be commodified. And maybe, I don't want to answer my own question here, but maybe the elements of Hollywood that became product were more readily commodified than other more nefarious elements of culture, which are very field dependent, very
Mm.
context bound, very imbued in the processes of learning throughout your lifetime.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and to just capture one moment and spread, which a film does. It captures one take out of who knows
Mm.
100 takes, and then chooses all the takes that the editor, or I'm not sure, the person behind the scenes, how they go about that process. But that globalized product is not necessarily the process that went into making a film. I imagine it must take ages to put these things together.
No, film, yes, it does. But going back on that, for instance, Stanislavski's books, and for the life of me, even though I've got them in the other room, I can't even remember the names of them, and they are famous. But the Russian versions are, like that. But he had one translator in America, so each book is about this thick.
Oh,
So there was that cultural perception. She left out loads.
yeah, interesting. Oh, very interesting.
And now there's versions coming out, but there was a cultural edit that occurred.
And books like that come about at very particular cultural moments too, don't they? We need to think about that too. And the same with codes and standards of normality. But then they create the pathway for future people to operate within. And sometimes I think when we're walking that path that has been laid before us, we forget that there's a history to
Mm.
the norms and standards that we have come to accept. You've brought a lot to the table for me today, and for listeners. One is, where we center the viewpoint from which we consider normality, whether we consider it from within the individual or whether we consider it from the universe.
Mm.
And that was a really exciting thing to bring to the table. Also, the thinking about the parameters, that normality isn't just about codes and standards. It's about the parameters of behavior that we will accept as socially acceptable.
Mm.
And the other thing that you've really brought to the table for me is there are certain codes and standards that will go global, and there were certain standards, and this is the way you've prompted my thinking.
Yes.
And perhaps
Yeah.
viewers will have other ideas, and I'm sure you've got plenty of other ideas. But some standards will go global, some standards will remain very context bound. What questions do you think we should be asking about normality?
I think if we're starting to consider normal and abnormality, the beginning point should be, what parameters am I placing it in? Am I talking about normality in my life? Am I talking about normality within my household? Am I talking about normality within the greater area that I live in or within the country? And how wide do my boundaries therefore need to go to define normality? Because to an extent, we do need some kind of definition if we're all going to live together of what's acceptable and what's not. And then normality doesn't necessarily mean that the abnormal is unacceptable. So I suppose we also need to think, within my parameters of normal, what am I allowed to stretch? What would I consider allowable
It almost
as
appears
abnormal?
it almost appears to me that when we ask these constructive questions, what do we wish to accept in our own lives, that we can almost let that word normal sort of drop from the conversation
Yeah,
altogether.
yeah,
And
that's good.
and one last thing that you brought to mind for me was normal might work in a laboratory setting, when you've got an experiment and you define normality with the experiment. And I think for me, the way in which the word normal has been popularized outside of laboratories and clinics, that is for me the point at which we need to start questioning the popularization of norms and
Yeah.
codes and standards. But that's not to take away from the very valuable question you have, which is, it's actually to play into your question, which is, we need to be very specific about normality is not something that's global. Normality is very context bound, and we need to understand the parameters for any definition of normality.
Yeah.
Nicholas Hope, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank
And
you for having me.
I also want to acknowledge Future Frame TV, Traces.Dreams, Marina Finetto, and everyone behind the scenes who makes this interview series possible, and for these discussions that I'm walking away from a changed person. So thanks again, Nicholas.
A pleasure, Paul. Thank you. It was great.